is the meaning of life? Is there a meaning to life? Does life have meaning? Or do people create meaning?
Far too often I meet people rather late in life, sometimes on their deathbed, who when they look back at life, they realize they weren't really there. They were out of touch with their own experience. And in this way, they've lost out on life. This is almost the worst thing that can happen to a person when you die. Of course, you can regret some of the things that you have done in life, and of course you can be forgiven, but the things that you have not done, the things you have neglected, that is much harder to forgive yourself.
Often it's the thought of our own death that makes us question how we're living. Are we living in a meaningful way? What is the meaning of life? Can philosophy help us answer these questions?
I think philosophy is a discipline for thinking about the most fundamental questions that face us and finding a way of living. Answering the question, how shall I live, is one of the most fundamental questions. Philosophy, perhaps more than any other discipline, has a role to play in answering that question of how we're going to live.
Many people look to religion to provide meaning for their lives. Can we find meaning by following the teachings of Buddha or Jesus? Is there a way that God intends for us to live? Is there a divine plan that can give purpose and meaning to our lives?
I think the answer is there is none. Life has evolved on this planet. We as human beings have evolved from other animals roughly by the means that Charles Darwin described over a century ago. There is no conscious direction of this process. There was no purpose for which it was started, or there was no providence watching over it. It simply happens.
When people ask the question about the meaning of life, they often ask it as though life is a kind of riddle set to us perhaps by God, which we have to puzzle out what the solution to the riddle is. It's seen as a bit like some ancient hieroglyphics on some stone that's discovered in the Middle East. I don't think that there is a puzzle that anyone has set us. I don't think there's a God, and so I don't think that life has a meaning that's intrinsic to it that we have to work out.
We no longer live in an age of faith. For more and more people, believing in God and attending church no longer provide a path to meaning. Still, many people are moved by an idea that has deep religious roots. This is the idea of human progress, the idea that history is progressing toward a goal. The modern philosophers Hegel and Marx adapted this idea to a non-religious framework. They argued that meaning for individual lives comes from contributing to the progress of history.
Hegel gives a very clear picture of what the ends of life are. Human beings are rational being, rational life. And then you see the whole of history as it were, bringing about, or designed in a sense to bring about, this end in which human beings come to the fullest realization of reason and freedom. So if you can identify with that as the ends of life, then you can get a deep sense of satisfaction and meaning out of, as it were, being part of this process and playing your role in bringing this about.
According to Marx, history is progressing toward a classless society and justice for all. This vision gave millions of people a sense of purpose and meaning. It inspired revolutions and the formation of communist social systems. But these systems collapsed. Today, it seems harder and harder to find meaning in relation to any big picture, either in religion or history. Does meaning lie in a different direction, in forgetting destiny and history and living in the moment? Does the meaning of life come from peak experiences of pleasure and excitement? Does meaning come from how many different things you can experience and how intensely?
If you compare our age to certain earlier ages, like 1500s in Europe, people were hemmed in by a series of ideals and ethics, religious and lay, that you just couldn't conceive of disengaging yourself from. There hasn't been, I don't think, ever an age like today where it was possible to fall into a kind of doubt about these altogether and to have this terrifying sense of meaninglessness, of emptiness. There's nothing really worthwhile. And this is not a happy plight. I mean, it's important, reveals something about human beings, that it's not that you could just say, oh, well, nothing big to do, so I'll just, take up little things in life. On the contrary, you can only happily take up little things in life, go out and play bridge or play golf and so on, if your life has some kind of meaning and purpose outside of that. Otherwise, it's anguish and misery. And this issue of what is worthwhile is a really difficult one for people because unlike earlier ages, it can collapse on you.
The modern anguish, then, is that we have been deprived of many of the traditional frameworks of meaning. But if we can't find meaning outside, perhaps we can look for it inside, in ourselves and our personal choices. The 19th century Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard anticipated this modern viewpoint. He believed that each person is a unique individual who will only live once. There is no truth with a capital T for everyone. Each person must find his or her own truth and meaning in life. What is crucial is to find an idea that you are willing to live and die for.
He put words on some of my own longing, my own search that I previously had hunches about, but here it was. I recognized it, and I got a confirmation, so that I dared to go on and search for my own way.
Leonard Koskinen first became intrigued by Kierkegaard's ideas about the meaning of life when he was a theology student.
Kierkegaard was an incredibly learned man in the classical sense, but he came to be criticized. He didn't have a philosophical system, and at that time, in the aftermath of Hegel and Hegel's philosophy, which was a complete system, people were looking for alternative systems, and they didn't find that in Kierkegaard. That was deliberate, but perhaps this was a reason why he never made the breakthrough in academic philosophy that he might have deserved.
Kierkegaard died when he was 42 years old. During his short life, he tried to find an explanation for his own anguish. He writes, "Anguish reaches its full maturity when the child becomes aware that it will be able to choose what it wants to do with its life."
So he saw anguish primarily as a symptom of people's awareness. The more aware a person, the more anguish she feels, because when you are aware, you can see the possibilities, but you can also see the consequences and realize how important this is, and still dare to make a choice.
For Kierkegaard, meaning is found by taking a personal stand. Many people don't. They just conform to expectations. Those who do take stands can move through several stages.
If you do choose a philosophical stance in life, he sees these as dividing into 3 stages. First is the aesthetic. That means you seek meaning by directing your life toward enjoyment, experiences of pleasure, experiences of beauty, excitement. This could describe much of our own time. Then there is the ethical stage. Here you direct yourself toward doing your duty, doing the right thing, serving society or the church or even God. And here you follow certain rules. The important thing is that you walk along a road that has been set. You don't deviate, and you are prepared to make great sacrifices.
In the 3rd stage, which Kierkegaard called the religious stage, you can't just follow prescribed rules. Your commitment has to be inward, passionate, and personal, and it has to go beyond the bounds of systematic reason.
The highest form of religious stage is not attainable by rational thinking, according to Kierkegaard. That is the paradox. Here, as he puts it, you throw yourself 70,000 fathoms deep without knowing where it ends. You give yourself over to the divine without a safety net, and that can sometimes be completely contrary to reason.
Kierkegaard's ideas about the uniqueness of every life and the need for an individual to take a stand and find his own meaning were controversial in his time and influential on later thinkers. They came to their greatest fruition a century later in the 20th century movement called existentialism. The person who most came to represent existentialism in the public eye was the French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre.
Well, of course, France in the 40s is a very traditional society, Christian society, where questions of meaning and value are supposed to be settled pretty much in advance. And when Sartre comes along with his existentialism in the atheistic form, of course it makes a huge impact and it divides people into 2 camps, so to speak.
Most controversially, Sartre and many other existentialists renounced belief in God as a possible source of meaning.
Existentialism, Sartre's version, lets man take the position that God had in a Christian ethics. God was the giver of value, of meaning. Now we have to do all that for ourselves. So, in a way, man is God in Sartre's philosophy. Now, how does that relate to Christian existentialists like Kierkegaard? In a way, Kierkegaard he's not a naive Christian. He lives in an age where atheism is a possibility. So he lives in the question, is there a God? And in a way, he has to, you might say that Kierkegaard creates God by his own decision rather than the other way around. There's no guarantee. You have to take the plunge out on 70,000 feet. Make God exist by your free decision in a way.
If there is no God, and if humans have to create their own meanings, then what can people use to get their bearings? How can we even know if we're on the right road?
Well, the question about the sort of life that Sartre would recommend for us is a bit complicated, of course. I mean, at the most basic level, Sartre has nothing to say about that. I mean, any sort of life is possible. You're free to choose your own life. You may take a very conventional life, have as little anxiety as possible. There's nothing in existentialism that forbids that, but on the other hand, that's not the sort of life that Sartre really wants us to live. He wants us to look freedom straight in the eye and make our own choices. Why is that? And I think behind everything in Sartre, there is some sort of intuition that you should live a true life. I mean, we are free. These are my decisions. I should realize that and live a life in that realization.
Sartre's exhortations to people to choose their own lives and accept the anguish that goes along with freedom can seem like a mockery to those who are faced with a hard struggle in life.
In a way, to some persons, Sartre's proclamation of human freedom might seem always an insult. I mean, if you're physically handicapped, you're very poor, where's your freedom then? And of course Sartre knows this, but what he says is that circumstances that determine your actions and your possibilities are not really factual circumstances. Things that to one person might destroy their lives, something they never can get out of, might be just the thing that makes another sort of life possible for another person. Freedom is not unlimited, but what limits it is something that is open to your own interpretation. That's Sartre's point.
Sartre's lifelong companion, the philosopher Simone de Beauvoir, started from the same position as Sartre, that there is no given meaning to life. There is no God and no divine plan. But de Beauvoir took this position in a different direction.
Unfortunately, Simone de Beauvoir has been regarded as lacking independence in relation to Sartre, and that is completely wrong. As time has passed, research has discovered this, and after reading her own texts for their own sake, you can say that the great difference between Sartre's early philosophy and Simone de Beauvoir's philosophy is that she, to a far greater extent, sees people as part of society, as always part of a context of others.
A central idea in existentialism is freedom. In Sartre's words, man is condemned to be free. But how free are women? In her book, The Second Sex, de Beauvoir examines this question.
Women have not had the chances to give their own meaning to their lives. Simone de Beauvoir means that women, contrary to men, have been placed in a situation that has not allowed for individuality to that extent. And this also goes back to the thought she has that womanhood has been set in advance as a sort of essence or nature. And the fundamental thought within existentialism is that, even though Simone de Beauvoir modifies it a bit, that existence precedes essence. That is, a person does not have a given nature or a given essence, and you are not this way or that. You are not born evil, like the Christians say, for example. And so she uses the second sex, where she says that women, just as little as men, have any specific essence. There is no specific womanhood. So women are individuals, just as men are individuals.
Women have always been the second sex, the sex that counts for less. In order for women to have the same freedom that men do to create their own meaning in life, society must change.
Men have been able to decide whether they want to dedicate themselves to one occupation or another, or to creative work, while women in traditional societies have been predestined to become wives and mothers, and have not at all had a free choice over their lives. So, for Simone de Beauvoir, morality is very important, so to speak. This thing about how should people live and how should we treat others. And for her, it is completely central that we must allow all people, as far as possible, to create their own lives, and this pertains to women as well. So she delivers a moral criticism toward the male-dominated society that has not permitted women to do this.
In her relationship with Sartre, de Beauvoir often stayed in the background. They supported each other in their work, but she chose to take a subordinate role in their public life.
I think it is very important to point out that she was incredibly independent in what she wrote. And both she and Sartre talked about how important they were to each other. They had a very intensive intellectual relationship. They read each other's texts. They criticized each other. But the personal relationship was very complicated. It has been understood afterwards that they had many other relationships on the side. The fact that Simone de Beauvoir tended to underestimate herself and to a certain extent subordinated herself to Sartre, we find difficult to accept as feminists today.
Perhaps the most striking feature of modern times is speed. The sheer speed of our machines matches the rapid changes in our lives. Once parents and children lived much the same lives, surrounded by the same buildings and customs. Now lives change radically from year to year. We are busy people, but sometimes it seems we're too busy to live.
We push ahead of ourselves. Already in school, we are taught that we learn not for school itself, but for life. And then you go to school 9, 10, 12 years, thinking then life begins. But then life doesn't begin. You start thinking later, when I have a job, then life begins. When I finish with my studies, then life begins. And that is how it is. When I have a family of my own, then life begins. When I get children, then life begins. When I get that promotion, then life begins. So we keep postponing it. Then, when I retire, then life begins. And this experience is a motivation for me when I meet people in the middle of their lives, to expose them to some challenges, to actually make something out of their lives right now, to dare to break up, to dare to make that choice, to dare to take that job, to dare to move, to dare to think along new lines, to dare to start that education if that is what feels right deep down, to dare to feel, what is it I want to do right now? And in this, to dare, the meaning of life is created. The meaning of life is not something that comes from heaven on a string and then life is finished, whatever the theologians say, but the meaning of life is created.
For those of us who are inclined to ask about the meaning of life, the first step seems to be to pause, to step back, to take the time to reflect, to ask how we feel about our lives, and to ask what holds meaning for us. For some, the ideas of philosophers can help with this reflection.
If you would take a lot of the superstructure, the philosophical argument away, then I think there are some basic insights in existentialism that most people can take into their hearts. And they have to do with realizing that there are some questions that you have to answer for yourself. Even if you choose to rely on authorities, on a traditional way of life, then you have to decide that. Who is the authority to rely on? That's your decision. So basically, there are things that must be rooted in yourself, and that's an important insight for Sartre, I think.
For some, even if grand schemes have been abandoned, the richest meaning in life still comes from looking outward, to other people or through time.
I think we have to choose how we're going to live, and the fundamental choice is whether to live in a narrow way for ourselves, concerned with our own status, wealth, whatever else it might be, or to live in some way that has broader ethical concerns. And, they don't have to necessarily mean dedicating yourself to a just world. They might be something more particular and more local, but still in a way that is concerned with others and with an ethical life.
Ce n'est pas mon rapport à la mort qui est important.
It's not my relation to death that is important, but my relation to my successors. Myself, I like very much to introduce the idea of the train of generations, the relation between the individual and the collective. You see, there are parents, children, filiation, and I think that filiation is a very important relation. Me, I have had the good fortune this summer to live in relation to 4 different generations. My age allows it. 4 generations. That means there are small children who are 80 years younger than me. I tell them stories from my youth when I heard my grandfather, who was 70 years old, tell me stories from his childhood. And so I pass it along to them. Do you know how much time that makes? It makes 150 years. So there we have a transgenerational time. And so we have to put the question of meaning on the scale of generations.
And for others, the potential meaning in moments, feelings, and personal experiences should not be taken lightly.
I would say the meaning of life is to be found in your grandest passions. That sounds very unphilosophical. And I think the reason is interesting. Because philosophers so often think the important thing is to live life rationally, however they understand that. I think the important thing is to live life intensely, emotionally, passionately. For most of us, it's going to be a grand passion of a much more ordinary sort. It's not going to take in the universe in the way that Hegel tried to. It's not going to be restricted to just our personal souls in confrontation with God, as Kierkegaard suggested, but it's going to be much richer, much more varied. And I think part of the reason why people get puzzled when you ask them about the meaning of life, apart from the fact that it's one of those big philosophical questions, is the fact that it seems there's so much richness there that has to be captured, and it sounds as if we're asking for a simple answer. And I would want to say, let's not give them a simple answer.
The Examined Life is a 26-part series for college credit. To purchase a video cassette or transcript of this program, call 626-796-7300 or visit us online. Please order by program number.